If you're looking to reduce your gasoline consumption for whatever reason you might want to do that, whether that's climate change, whether that's energy independence for the United States, or whether it's simply to insulate your pocketbook from fluctuations in gasoline pricing, you should definitely put a high-efficiency plug-in hybrid like this Kia Niro on your shopping list. Rated at 108 mpge and 48 miles per gallon as a hybrid, this is simply one of the most efficient things you can drive in America today. In this video, let's talk about the Niro plug-in hybrid, why you might want one, why you might want the hybrid, obviously that would be if you couldn't plug it in at all, and why you might want a plug-in hybrid like this over the Kia Niro EV, which will give you 250 miles of range and of course consume no gasoline at all. I'm going to digress for just one moment and wade a tiny bit into politics. Electrified vehicles have become very politicized lately, and that wasn't always the case. In fact, back in 2007, well-known liberal George W. Bush, I'm kidding there of course, passed one of the most sweeping changes to North American fuel economy legislation since the 1970s oil crisis. And that was simply about energy independence. If everybody in America drove a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid and charged whenever they could, America would become an oil exporting nation, not an oil importing nation. It's as simple as that. And let's talk about that math for a bit. Obviously, if you buy a Niro EV, you'd use 0 gallons a year. My commute is a little bit longer than average for North America, 64 miles round trip, 16,640 miles yearly. Let's take a look at how these numbers would stack up. Again, EV, 0 gallons consumed. This plug-in hybrid with my driving profile, based on the last 400 miles of driving this exact vehicle, I would consume about 83 gallons of gasoline a year. Not too much. If I were to drive the hybrid model, even though the hybrid would get you slightly better fuel economy, theoretically, you'd be consuming 339 gallons of gasoline. That's a pretty big difference. If you were to compare that to a gasoline vehicle with approximately the same size, say a Kia Soul, which is 31 miles per gallon rated, you'd be consuming 536 gallons of gasoline. So again, plug-in hybrids are about mitigating your gasoline consumption, not replacing it. If you can't charge, don't charge. You could still get a hybrid and still reduce your gasoline consumption by about 200 gallons a year. If you have the ability to plug in at home, even on 110, or you have the ability to plug in at the office, you could drop your energy consumption even further. Obviously, reducing your gasoline consumption is going to have an impact on your pocketbook, but it may not be as large as some people want to say. Here in California, you can opt through PG&E to get 100% renewable sourced energy. That's about 28 cents per kilowatt hour. It's a little on the pricey side. And as a result, operating this plug-in hybrid, even though you would be using a lot less gas than in the hybrid model, it's actually going to cost you a little bit more. The hybrid model at $5 a gallon would cost you about $1,553 yearly to run on my commute. This would be about $1,062 of electricity, $415 of gasoline, about $1,577. Now, I do live off-grid, and in the summer, I could charge this quote-unquote for free, but my entire off-grid solar system costs something, and I'm pretty darn sure it was more than 28 cents per kilowatt hour, even if I continue to use this exact solar system for 20 years. Now, interestingly enough, if I were to take a look at the operational cost of a full electric Niro at 28 cents per kilowatt hour, the full electric Niro might actually cost about the same or perhaps a little bit more than fueling the hybrid model, and the EV is going to be more expensive. That's the other reason you might want to take a look at a plug-in hybrid. This is about $4,000 more than the regular hybrid, but you get more power, you get a little bit more standard feature content, you get access to the carpool lanes in states like California, and it is $6,000 less expensive than a full EV. So if you want to go green and your pockets aren't that deep, you should definitely take a look at a plug-in hybrid. If you want to know more on this topic, I'm going to have a separate video on it. Be sure and stay tuned for that one. With that digression out of the way, it's time to get off my soapbox and get back into the Niro. The Niro looks a lot boxier and a lot more attractive than the first generation model. The first generation was a little on the bubbly side, and even though this has grown versus the first generation Niro, it hasn't grown by that much, even though the styling makes this look a lot bigger. You will really notice how small it is, though, if you park it next to a Kia Sportage. This is still a subcompact, pregnant hatch crossover, whatever you want to call it. Keep in mind, no all-wheel drive option on the Niro or the Niro plug-in. We get a variant of the Kia front end that we've seen before. It's not quite the tiger nose that we've seen, although there is kind of a tiger nose section up there at the top of the hood. A lot less cooling going on than in a full gasoline vehicle, just as you'd expect. Not much of it is used when it's operating in electric mode. We have full LED headlights and LED fog lights below. LED fog lights are something that are missing on a lot of EVs. I have to say, I like these headlights a bit more than the one that we see on the full EV from Kia, the EV6. In addition to relatively small grills on the front end, the Niro also has active grille shutters to further improve aerodynamic efficiency. One of the interesting things about the Niro's design is that some of these lines are difficult to execute well on a new vehicle. For instance, the way this hood integrates with the fender and the way that it wraps around, this line is very consistent all the way around the vehicle. It kind of is an optical illusion here. There's a little rubber gasket right here to help improve aerodynamics that we don't find on this side, but the panel gaps are very consistent on the Niro. I was definitely impressed by that. Be sure and sound off in the comment section. Let me know what you would cross-shop against the Niro, especially if you have cross-shopped the Niro. In my mind, it's basically Prius, 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 because it's the only other high-efficiency hybrid and plug-in hybrid available in the United States, even though it is not shaped like this at all. This is solidly a boxy hatchback, and the Prius is trying to be a sexy liftback meets sedan, especially in its latest version. This is also a little bit smaller at 174 inches long. So size-wise, this is more like a Corolla Cross, more like a Honda HR-V, something along those lines. But we don't have all-wheel drive. Obviously, you could compare it to something like those options, but they aren't going to be nearly as fuel efficient even if you choose front-wheel drive in those models. Also, the Corolla Cross doesn't really appear to be overly focused on efficiency. It's going to be under 40 miles per gallon, and versions of the Niro will go over 50 miles per gallon. So again, in that respect, this is a lot more similar to the Prius. Now, a lot of folks have been asking me about this thing right here. It is the aero blade. Air goes in here and then out here. It kind of makes it look wider with also giving it a slightly better aero profile. You can get it in body color. In fact, actually most versions of the Niro will have this body colored. You have to pay a little bit extra for the bicolor look here. I don't think I would get it in my Kia if I were going to get one. I think I like the blue, but I would get the blue with just the entire thing blue. If you live in an area that occasionally gets a bit of snow and you're wondering if you could live without all-wheel drive, we do have 6.3 inches of ground clearance, which could help that math. When it comes to tires, we have wider tires than we find in the Prius, which surprised me a bit in this latest Prius generation. 225 width tires on this top-end SX trim. Those go down a little bit for the EX trim, and all Priuses for 2023 are going to have 195 width tires on them. The Prius is about the same curb weight as the Niro, so when it comes to handling, I'll let you do the math. The angular styling certainly makes this generation Niro look a bit more crossover-like versus the first generation. We have these boomerang-shaped tail lamps up here. You'll find the turn signals and backup lights down there at the bottom of the bumper, and windshield wiper lovers rejoice, there is one back here on the rear window. Interesting twist with these aero blades. They definitely are a style statement. They help the vehicle look wider without really having much of an aerodynamic impact. Air goes in over here, just behind the rear doors, and then comes out just this little section right down here. If you're a fastidious car washer, you should know that cleaning this duct is a little bit tricky, and these two areas up here are not ducts, and as you can see, they tend to collect some random stuff. Bearing in mind that the plug-in version of the Niro starts one trim level up from the regular hybrid model, we get a lot of standard active safety tech here. Autonomous emergency braking, adaptive cruise control, blind spot monitoring, rear cross-traffic detection, driver attention monitoring, rear parking sensors, and auto high beams are all standard. If you get a fully loaded model like I'm driving today, it'll add things like the highway driving assistant, that's Kia's aggressive lane centering program, front parking sensors in addition to the rears, and an expanded auto braking program that will work in intersections. It will also detect cyclists, pedestrians, in addition to vehicles. Under the hood, we find Kia's most efficient hybrid system in the US. This is based around a 1.6-liter four-cylinder engine, producing 105 horsepower in its own right. It's then mated to 2 motor generator units and a 6-speed dual-clutch transmission. There have been some changes versus the first generation of the Niro. The biggest change for the plug-in hybrid is that this now gets extra power, thanks to a more powerful electric motor and a different battery in the back. Let's talk about how this system works. The engine is based around one of the other engines in Hyundai and Kia's lineup, but it has been modified for hybrid duty, so it now runs on the Atkinson cycle in order to improve efficiency. It's then mated over here on this side to a belt-driven 8-kilowatt motor generator unit that will start the engine and it will generate power. This technically can operate in a serial hybrid mode, and it will do that occasionally, mainly at lower speeds or right when you're tapering off of the plug-in hybrid portion of the battery pack. The system can then generate power, move it over there to the other electric motor or to the battery in the rear. The other electric motor is the bigger one, connected to the 6-speed dual-clutch transmission. It's a 62-kilowatt motor, and everything combined gives us 180 horsepower, 195 pound-feet of torque. One of the things you'll notice about this hybrid system is that the dual clutch is one of the smoothest DCTs available in North America. It's not quite as smooth as a traditional automatic like you'll find in a Kia Sportage hybrid, but it is smoother than Hyundai and Kia's own 8-speed dual clutch that's used elsewhere in the lineup, or the dual clutches we find from Volkswagen, Audi, Mercedes, etc. And that's all because of the way the motor is integrated into the unit. The motor is always attached to the transmission, so it doesn't have to slip the clutch, it can just turn on and off the motor when you're at a stoplight and you're accelerating away. It also can help smooth out the shifts as the vehicle is operating in hybrid mode. Now the battery pack, that's located in the rear. It's an 11.1 kilowatt hour lithium pack that's bigger than the outgoing 8.9 we found in the previous generation. This pack is also more powerful in addition to being higher capacity, so it can dissipate 83 kilowatts max. That's enough to drive the car, start the engine, and heat the cabin all at the same time. So unlike some of the first generation plug-in hybrids we saw in the US, where if you're flooring it, you would notice kind of a weird dip in the electric output as it tries to start the engine, you don't find that in here. You get very consistent power delivery, then the engine starts, and then you get all 180 ponies. Everything together is good for 32 to 33 miles of electric range and 48 miles per gallon after that's been exhausted. One weird twist with the Niro is that the electric cabin heater is optional. It's $500 to $600 depending on the trim level you're looking at, and it bundles with it heated rear seats and a heated steering wheel. If you don't choose that option, then it's going to heat the cabin the same way the first generation plug-in did, which is basically it runs the engine, generates power with the generator, so you're not just burning gasoline for nothing, and then it uses the waste heat from the engine to heat the cabin. So it's basically operating in serial hybrid mode if the weather is cooler. This model has the optional heater, and it's about 45 degrees out here or so, and it's just heating the cabin on its own. That will, however, decrease your all-electric range. Thanks to the Niro's focus on efficiency, it doesn't take a terribly big battery to give this the 33 miles of electric range. Kia's been a little cagey on exact battery specifications, but I suspect only about 10 kilowatt hours of this battery pack is usable. It's charged via this port right here on the front fender, and an onboard 3.8 kilowatt level 2 charger. If you want to install a level 2 charger at home, you can take this from 0 to completely full in 2 hours and 40 minutes. But a lot of folks won't even need to bother, because this only takes 8 hours to completely charge on a 120 volt cable like the one that's actually included with the Niro from the factory. If you're concerned about the cost of installing an EV charger at home or the increased electrical demand that would cause on your home, know that if you get a high-efficiency plug-in hybrid like this, you don't necessarily have to. You can charge this just fine off of the regular 120-volt outlet in your garage. It will take a little bit longer, but this will get completely full overnight. And if you want to take things to the next level and charge it a bit faster, all you would need is a 20-amp 240 circuit. Basically the same kind of circuit that you would run a larger wall air conditioning off of. If you're a taller driver or you frequently have tall people in the vehicle, you're probably going to want to take a look at the Niro over the Prius. Also, if you prefer a more upright, more SUV-like driving position, you're going to want to take a look at this as well. With just over 40 inches of front headroom, this is definitely roomier than the Prius's swoopy roofline, but you'll notice a bigger difference in the back. Over here we have a multi-way powered driver's seat with 2-way adjustable lumbar, 2-position memory over there on the door, and a tilt-telescopic steering column with a pretty decent range of motion. Because of the more upright driving position, shorter drivers I think are going to like the Niro a bit more than the Prius. If you frequently have a front passenger with you as you're driving, keep in mind that even in this top trim, the passenger seat is manual. Jumping into the back, we find a seating position that's just about as upright as the front, so if you don't like your legs really stretching out in front of you, you might want to take a look at this. With just over 81 inches of combined legroom, this is a little bit roomier than the Prius, but most importantly, I get about 3 inches more rear headroom. So even with my head all the way back here to the headrest, I still have about 2 inches of headroom left, and in the Prius, I can't actually sit upright in the back. That really surprised me that headroom in that model reduced so much in this generation. If I scoot over here to the middle seat, you'll notice that the Niro is a subcompact vehicle, so the rear bench is definitely narrower than a Kia Sportage. Scooting all the way over to the right, this front seat's all the way back in its tracks. You can see I still have several inches of room left. This is a really roomy interior. Now, when it comes to child seat installation, I was able to just barely squeeze a rear-facing child seat behind myself, but I did have to adjust my seating position a little bit. You might be wondering, with this much legroom, how is that possible? Well, remember how legroom is calculated. It's a measurement from basically back here at your hip point all the way across to where a theoretical knee would be, and then down at an angle towards the floor. So the more upright the seating position in the vehicle, the more basic legroom that you get. That doesn't mean that the front seats and the back seats really have moved that far apart. If you lift them all off the ground a bit, you get more legroom without changing the seat position. When it comes to rear passenger accommodation, I definitely put the Niro above the Prius. The Prius's doors got smaller, the Prius's back seat got smaller, and the cargo area is not as square. You'll really notice that back there, and of course, if you fold down the 60/40 folding rear seats, you can box your items all the way into the cabin. Behind the available power hatch, we find just under 20 cubic feet of cargo space. That puts this right in line with the new Prius. Its cargo area shrunk by about 30% in this generation. Now, there is a consideration for the hybrid versus plug-in hybrid debate. This cargo area is a little bit smaller. What's weird about that is that the hybrid version and the full electric version get the same cargo area, just over 22 cubic feet. This one has a slight reduction because of what's under the floor. The plug-in lacks the dual height load floor because the battery is bigger. That battery is located pretty much under the rear seats. We then have the gas tank right here and then a subwoofer close to the opening. There is enough room, however, for you to store your charge cable back here. Before we go out on the paved road, let's talk about the dual clutch transmission again. Remember how I said it was smoother and it doesn't feel exactly like a dual clutch? Well, this is one of the situations where that applies. Low speed crawl. According to the speedometer, I'm going 0 miles an hour, so less than 1 mile an hour. And this is absolutely smooth. Even if I put this into hybrid mode, where it's going to start the engine, it's smooth driving along because the electric motor is what's actually moving the vehicle at 1 mile an hour. In low speed situations, this is a serial hybrid. The engine is running, it's generating power, moving that over to the traction motor. That's what's driving the vehicle along. Now, if I speed things up a little bit, the clutch is able to engage the engine, but it can do that very smoothly because the motor's pretty powerful. It gets things in speed sync, and then they can engage. And then if I slow down a little bit here again, notice I rolled back there a little bit, it then disengages and just the electric motor is driving the vehicle forward. That transition is much smoother in this generation Niro than it was in the past. This might sound similar to Honda and Mitsubishi hybrids, but the big difference here is the speed where this happens. This is basically just going to be at very low speeds. If I come to a stop here, engine turns off, floor it, the engine turns on, it's a serial hybrid for just a hot second, and then it goes 0 to 60 with the engine involved. And of course, you'll feel those stepped automatic shifts. This is going to go from 0 to 60 in our testing in 7.2 seconds. That is significantly faster than the outgoing model. It's about as fast as the regular Prius. The plug-in hybrid Prius is going to be a bit quicker. The other time you'll find serial hybrid operation is in a kind of a limited mode as well. If you're in electric-only operation and you're, say, climbing a steep hill, you just can't get enough oomph out of the battery for what you're doing. It'll start the engine, it'll start providing a little bit of extra power with that generator, and it's going to warm things up to prepare for hybrid mode later. But basically 99.9% of the time, this is only a parallel hybrid. In my 60 to 0 stopping test, it took 120 feet for this to stop. That is going to be a little bit longer if you get the base version. I'm guessing probably about 7 feet or so. The shorter stopping distance is thanks to the wider tires, so even though the top end trim is going to be the heaviest version, it's going to stop the quickest because of the tires. When it comes to handling, keep in mind we do have a fully independent suspension in the rear and wider tires than we find in the Prius. The Prius's rear suspension is best described as a semi-independent unit. I'll dive into that in a different video if you guys really want me to, but essentially, over broken pavement in a corner, you can get some motion on the other side of the vehicle when one side impacts a pothole. That doesn't happen in this vehicle. It's a fully independent design, and thanks to the wider tires and very similar curb weight, this does have better handling in neutral handling situations than the Prius. But there's another twist here. The Prius has the availability of an all-wheel drive system that can send 40 horsepower to the rear. That definitely improves handling because now in the new Prius, it can use that electric motor at a wider variety of speeds than the previous generation all-wheel drive model. The other thing you should know is that the Prius is going to be quicker than the Niro like model to like model. This is really close to the regular hybrid version of the Prius in terms of acceleration, but the plug-in Prius is going to be faster than this, and the regular Prius is faster than the regular Niro. Logically, however, the Niro is going to appeal to a broader set than the Prius because this is that practical hatchback form, very similar to what we find in a Seltos or an HR-V or a Toyota Corolla Cross. And the curb weight of this vehicle is shockingly similar to an HR-V or a Corolla Cross, even though this is a plug-in hybrid. And that did surprise me. In fact, depending on the models that we're talking about, you can actually get an HR-V that's a little bit heavier than this. Obviously, that would have all-wheel drive, but the curb weight is still right in that same range. So as far as handling in the compact crossover segment goes, this does quite well. Thanks to the battery pack being in the rear, it has a slightly better weight balance than average for a front-wheel drive entry in this group, and the weight is a little bit lower in the vehicle than in some of those competitors as well. If you wanted to take handling to the next level, clearly you could put some grippier tires on this, and that is the one area where the Niro is going to suffer a bit, is that these tires are more eco-focused than average in the segment, so that's definitely something you should keep in mind. When it comes to ride quality, I'm going to give the Niro a B. This is a little bit firmer than the average compact crossover, so I think a Sportage is going to be a little bit softer in some situations. And remember, this does have a shorter wheelbase than those larger plug-in hybrids, so the suspension doesn't have as much time to settle after the front suspension has impacted something and then the rear suspension impacts it. But this is pretty consistent with something like the HR-V, the Kia Seltos, etc. Some folks I know have described the suspension tuning as a little bit too firm. I, on the other hand, think this is a decent balance, and it fits kind of in with the personality of the new Niro being a little bit sportier, a little bit more engaging than it was in the last generation. When it comes to the cabin noise score, I was quite surprised. This came in at 71.5 decibels, making this quieter than I had expected, so clearly I'm going to have to give this an A. As far as fuel economy goes, this has done really, really well. Rather unfortunately, Kia does not give us any sort of screen here in the infotainment setting or in this little tiny instrument cluster that will show you your miles per kilowatt hour when in EV mode, but back of the napkin calculations put this at approximately 3.3 miles per kilowatt hour. The Niro is also quite efficient when operating as a hybrid. According to the EPA, this should be getting just under 50 miles per gallon. On my daily commute, I averaged 51 miles per gallon, not plugging in at either end. And that's mainly because of the size of the battery pack. This vehicle can keep recharging, regenerating the battery on the way down the mountain pass. I go up and over a 2,200-foot mountain pass every day, and the regular hybrid would get its battery full. So depending on your driving situation, lugging around the extra weight of the battery pack may be advantageous. In my situation, it certainly is. Versus a comparably equipped regular Niro, the last generation, and I suspect this generation as well, performs a little bit better thanks to the bigger battery pack. Thanks to the bigger battery pack, we also have a trick that we don't normally find in plug-in hybrids. We have adjustable regen with these regen paddles, and it can get pretty aggressive. I can also max it out by holding that down, and it will come basically to a complete stop here. Right there, actual complete stop. It's not quite one pedal driving, but it's relatively close if you're willing to use the paddles. Logically, of course, coasting as much as possible is going to be the most efficient way to drive the vehicle, but I do love the fact that we can adjust the throttle lift-off regen here. Now keep in mind, power is going through that 6-speed transmission. So as you're accelerating in EV mode and as you're braking in EV mode and regenning power back into the battery, the transmission will be shifting. It doesn't shift as often as a vehicle with a regular gasoline engine under there because we have so much torque from the electric motor, but it is going to happen. And some people seem really turned off by that for some reason. It doesn't bother me at all, and that is likely the big reason that this can have a relatively small electric motor, operate at highway speeds relatively easily in electric-only mode, and then of course have over 100 mpge on the efficiency cycle. The 6-speed dual-clutch transmission is an essential component to the efficiency of this vehicle in hybrid mode and in EV mode. If you live in a mountainous or a hilly area as I do, keep the dual-clutch transmission in mind. As I said before, it doesn't have to slip the clutch to go from 0 to 5 miles an hour, but between first and second gear on steeper slopes, you are going to notice that transition in electric operation. So let's just go ahead and try it here. If I press on the accelerator pedal, it's going to start accelerating up the hill. It's got a little bit of scrabble there. And then we get a moment where there's no power, and then the transmission shifts, and then we get the next gear. It's going to feel very much like any other vehicle with a dual clutch transmission in those shifts. It's going to be pretty smooth, but it's still going to happen, and for some reason that does tend to offend some folks. If you want to get your hands on the plug-in hybrid Niro, be prepared to pay more than the regular hybrid model, obviously. This starts at $33,740, and that's mainly because it starts in the EX trim level, which is sort of the mid-level trim in the regular hybrid lineup. Then, of course, you have to pay the approximately $1,300 destination charge. That is about $4,600 more than the hybrid model, but $6,000 less than the electric model. So plug-in hybrid, quite logically, is right in between. You might want to take a look at this over the regular hybrid if, obviously, you want to reduce your gasoline consumption, if you like that plug, if you want a little bit of extra power, or if you want HOV lane access in states like California. Now, very clearly, when this model was designed, as with the first generation, there was still a tax credit for vehicles like this in the United States. Unfortunately, at the moment, because this is built in South Korea, it does not qualify for any federal tax credit at all. It's a bit of a bummer because in the past, the Niro plug-in hybrid was effectively less expensive than the one without the plug, so it made a lot of sense. Now, basically, you have to want the plug in order to spend the extra cash, which, of course, is the same thing going on for the electric one. But again, this is a lot less expensive. Be sure and let me know what you think about that all down there in the comment section. We don't have pricing yet on the upcoming Prius Prime. I would not be surprised if it was a bit more expensive than this, however. Now, unlike the rest of the Prius lineup, the plug-in Prius is not going to be available with all-wheel drive, but it is going to get you significantly more power than this. It's going to be about 220 horsepower, and it's definitely going to be swifter than this. This is, again, about 9.5 seconds, 0 to 60, and the Prius Prime is going to be about 6.5 seconds, 0 to 60, so quite a different kind of animal. It's likely going to be a bit more expensive. It's not going to qualify for any federal tax credit either. Thanks to recent changes to the tax credit scheme, there are very few plug-in hybrids that will still get one in 2023, and most of those will be found at the Jeep dealer. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comments section. Check out the related videos, and I'll see all of you next week.